Good morning, everyone, from steamy Washington, D.C., and welcome to the Asia Society Policy Institute's webinar, Aligning Across Hemispheres, the IP4, and the NATO Summit. I'm Emma Chanlett-Avery. I'm the Director for Political Security Affairs at ASPE and the Deputy Director of our Washington, D.C. office. I'll be moderating this session over the next hour or so. For those of you not familiar with the Indo-Pacific Four, this is a grouping comprised of Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand, collectively known as the IP4 and considered to be the partner countries of NATO. These leaders first met together in 2022 on the sidelines of the NATO Summit, continued that tradition for the next few years, but last year only had one leader in attendance. This grouping is basically shaped by shared concerns about Russia and China, driven particularly by Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022, and also an increasing recognition that the security issues of Asia and Europe are interlinked, and there is a degree of strategic convergence between these countries. I think that there's now, despite the origins of this IP4, now there's an additional factor that is really driving this cooperation, and that's the United States, and the sense that there is some degree of unreliability and new demands from the Trump administration. This year, only the South Korean president, President Lee, was the only leader to attend the summit, but the other countries did send their defense ministers, with Japan additionally sending their Minister of Foreign Affairs. So through this conversation, we're going to explore what each of the countries brings, what they are looking for in terms of cooperation through this mechanism, and also talk a little bit about the emergence of middle power engagement and what is sort of the right size institution to drive this sort of cooperation. I'm going to introduce the panelists and tell the audience too that you can submit questions through the Q&A function, and we will try to get to those by the end of the session today. So let me now turn to this fabulous panel that's going to enlighten us over the next hour or so. First, we have Mira Rapp-Hooper. Mira is a senior advisor at the Asia Group and a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. Also served as a special assistant to the president during the Biden administration and senior director for Asia and Oceania. Welcome, Mira. Next, we have Yuka Koshino. Yuka is a partner at Ferocity Capital and also research fellow at the Research Institute for Advanced Innovation and Geostrategy, which is a brand new think tank. I think it just started in April of this year at the International House of Japan. Ruben Steff is an assistant professor at Mendel University, which is in Brno, in the Czech Republic, where I happen to have deep family roots. He is a Kiwi and previously served in the New Zealand Ministry for Foreign Affairs and Trade. Great to have him. And Kuyong Chung is an assistant professor of political science at Kangwon National University and a non-resident fellow at the Asan Institute, also serves on advisory committees for the current government, and in a stroke of coincidence is actually in Prague right now. So we have a fabulous representation from the Czech Republic on the call today. So let's dive right in. Mira, I'm going to start with you. In your role on the National Security Council with the Biden administration, you played a role in sort of fostering the IP4 throughout your years there. So if you can just take us back about why you did that, how you did that, the extent to which you see this as a valuable mechanism for security. Mira, over to you.
Thanks so much, Emma. Thanks so much to the Asia Society for convening this important discussion today. And it's great to be here alongside such distinguished colleagues on a really important topic. As you say, Emma, from the early days of the Biden administration, we had a very strong sense, I would say really pushed by National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, that the U.S. alliance systems in both Europe and Asia needed updating in some really important ways. Of course, at the point that President Biden took office in January 2021, we were coming off the first Trump administration, and particularly in Asia, where I and my team were laser focused, there was a lot we felt we needed to do to kind of repair, restore, and and begin modernizing those alliances. When we thought about the work that was in front of us in the Indo-Pacific in particular, one of the key goals that we set out for ourselves was to increasingly foster networking and real collective capacity building amongst America's closest allies and partners in the Indo-Pacific. Because in this region, we have some of our strongest allies around the world, incredibly dependable, resilient democracies, strong economies, strong states in terms of their approaches to security, but unfortunately still had a U.S. bilateral alliance system largely based on Cold War extended deterrence and security cooperation that didn't really have an architecture that allowed those countries to exert the full cooperation that they might with one another. So we saw a real mandate inside the Indo-Pacific to try to increase the networking amongst our closest friends, with the United States as a core part of that. And of course, you see that in all of the different minilateral configurations that the Biden administration really spurred and poured a lot of energy into, whether that's the US ROK Japan trilateral, the Quad, AUKUS, or the IP4 as a configuration within NATO. But part of the Biden administration's theory of the case was also not just that we had an agenda cut out for us inside of the Indo-Pacific. There was a concomitant one in Europe, but the idea that the United States would be able to advance its interests more effectively, and so would its allies, if allies in Europe and Asia were increasingly able to collaborate with one another. We saw, as you referenced, Emma, increasing challenges from both Russia and China that often crossed borders and crossed regions. You could think, for example, of China's use of cyber attacks, of disinformation to shape the political space, or troubling diplomatic response during the COVID pandemic that really helped European partners to understand that we were dealing with a profound geopolitical challenge. So as we saw it, it did not make sense for these two regions to sort of proceed on parallel tracks, grappling with the same set of challenges that really bridged the two hemispheres. Rather, we increasingly needed some sort of mechanism to promote cooperation amongst the two alliance systems, and that was largely the genesis of the first AP4, which became the IP4. In the minds of everyone I worked for, this was a really important mechanism, and I think it remains one today. In particular, we saw that after the IP4 was founded, the use cases for its existence only continued to mount. Of course, Russia invaded Ukraine, which poses and continues to pose to this day profound challenges to Europe, but also to our partners in the Indo-Pacific, many of whom stepped up to become huge supporters of Ukraine's defense. But as that war began to unfold, we also understood that there were other dimensions to it, including Chinese industrial-based support to Russia, and much later, North Korea's decision to send troops to the front lines alongside Moscow. So as these relationships between China and Russia appeared to get tighter, DPRK and Russia began to get tighter, the logic for the IP4 only grew and grew. Now, that's not to say that there are no roadblocks or hurdles to this configuration. There are many, and I know we'll discuss them over the course of the conversation. As we're seeing sort of case in point today, there is only one IP4 leader in attendance at this year's NATO Summit, President Lee Jae-myung. It can be very hard to coordinate the IP4 leaders to attend a NATO Summit, and that's a critical role that the United States has traditionally played in pushing the IP4 leaders to get to NATO and to really seize this as an opportunity. But likewise, there are many challenges running in the NATO to Indo-Pacific direction too. NATO countries are sometimes a bit allergic to any implication that NATO would operate out of area, that is to say, take on missions in the Indo-Pacific. So over the course of the life of the IP4, it's been really important to identify spaces where these two groups of partners truly have concomitant interests that nonetheless allow them to stay laser focused on their security areas of primary concern. A lot to unpack there. I'm really looking forward to hearing from the colleagues on this panel about their perspectives on how this mechanism has served their country. But suffice it to say, with the relationship between the PRC and China, PRC and Moscow, Moscow and DPRK still going strong, I tend to think that the IP4 is a mechanism whose time is still very much in front of us.
Great, Mira. That's a terrific framing for our conversation. And it really is remarkable how in the last several years we've seen this strategic convergence of interests. We see that at the Shangri-La dialogue, for example, too. Notes towards that. So lots and lots of questions that I could ask to layer on top of that. But let me turn to some of our other panelists. Kuyun, is your internet connection okay now?
Yeah, it works now.
Okay, perfect. So I'm going to go to you next because, as we referenced, President Lee was the only leader to attend the
Yep.
IP4 this year.
Mhm.
Very notable that he decided to do that. So I want to talk a little bit about, what was his motivation in going there alone, and the extent to which South Korea's booming arms export industry particularly with European countries, may have driven some of that decision making. Kuyun,
Mhm.
over to you.
Yes, it was pretty surprising for me that the current administration shows enthusiasm toward NATO Summit and IP4 gathering, because initially the earlier times when he just became the president, there was a kind of debate within the president office whether South Korea need to join NATO Summit or not, because there were multiple venues that South Korea has to be in, but there was a kind of limited availability, so there was a debate. So, which shows that the current administration's kind of cautious approach toward the NATO summit. But now I think President Lee Jae-myung understands the current strategic landscape and how difficult, how not just difficult, more complex than just U.S.-China strategic competitions. I would say it is kind of complex and competition, not just about great power, but different domains are kind of become the these crisis management. So he understand that, so he decided to join and become more taking a step outside Korean Peninsula. So that I think that's a kind of one primary motivation behind his attendance this time. And another thing that I have to comment is that his attendance shows that South Korea's engagement with NATO is no longer only a conservative government project. As you all know, Yoon Suk-yeol was the first South Korean president to attend NATO summit in 2022. And Lee's participation indicates that now there is a broader cross-party shift toward expanding South Korea's role beyond Korean Peninsula and take the more broader global security positions in the world. So I think it is fair to say that South Korea is leaning toward NATO engagement and try to explore more domains and areas of cooperation with NATO partners. And another thing that I would comment is that another motivation for South Korea's attendance was about defense sales and cooperation with defense industry with NATO members. In the past, like Poland actually purchased South Korean K2 tank and K9 and FA-50 aircraft and Chanlett rocket systems. Actually, that made South Korea a real contributor to European deterrence, not just about Indo-Pacific dialogue partners. And actually, this is kind of opened the door for South Korea to cooperate on defense industry, not just about, dialogue, but actual R&D and production maintenance and supply chains, and how South Korea can be integrated into South defense industry kind of ecosystems in European continents. But there are kind of reservations and as well. As I mentioned earlier, Europe is moving toward strengthening its own defense industrial base and keep the more production within Europe, which make it a little bit difficult for outside suppliers like South Korea and Japan and other Asian countries to be integrated into a European network. And how that a kind of tendency maintain in the future, we have to remain to see. But at this moment, South Korea's kind of understanding is that even though we are willing to kind of join and contribute, there might be a kind of ceiling in terms of defense industrial cooperation. And another things that make South Korea make more reservations about this defense industrial cooperation is that this is not just about like a goods and kind of services that we learned in economics, but it is defense sales, which means that there should be a interoperability, standardizations when it comes to technology, which need related to like strategic cooperation, not just technological cooperation. There should be a consideration about strategic cooperation with NATO members. But this governments, the governments progressive, which are also concerned about North Korea, and they have slightly different view about this trilateral alignment with North Korea, Russia, and China. So they make this alignment making more a little bit cautious about how far South Korea can align with this NATO members in terms of strategic level. So defense sale has been in the short term. Defense sales has been a good driver for South Korea to join this summit, but at the same time, there is kind of reservation and still a discussion going on in South Korea about how far South Korea can join this effort.
Thanks, Kuyun, for those remarks. I mean, it is really remarkable that in the Ukraine war, we've had, North Korean soldiers
I know.
fighting, being attacked by South Korean arms exports. I mean, it's really crystallizes how these theaters can intertwine. Also, Turkey is a competitor for South Korean arms sales.
I know.
Yeah, so that was sort of a
So we
bold
are
move,
cooperating.
too. It was, and also I appreciate you pointing out that this has crossed party lines in South Korean politics. I mean, Korean politics can be sort of a blood sport, but I love this idea that it's such a notion, so quaint that the politics stops at the water's edge. I love that approach. So let's turn to Tokyo now and to Koshino-san. I thought it was sort of remarkable that Takaichi decided not to come. I mean, I know she's facing some diet challenges at home, but she has been really vigorous in pursuing meetings with other middle power leaders. I mean, I think in 2026 alone, she's hosted Canada, France, Italy, India, UK, South Korea. So is this a missed opportunity for her to not go and engage further there?
Thanks, Emma, and thanks for inviting me to this important discussions around IP4 and to discuss the outcomes of the NATO Summit. I do also agree that it was a missed opportunity for Prime Minister Takaichi, especially she has been actively engaging with like-minded partners in the region, but also beyond the region, and also with the close relationship with President Lee from South Korea. It would certainly have created a momentum for IP4 NATO engagement if she had attended. But I would also like to mention that it's not the first time that Japanese leaders had to miss these important diplomatic opportunities because of political schedules. And currently, Takaichi-san is facing domestic political challenges, so she had to prioritize that. That being said, I would say that that doesn't necessarily mean that Japan's presence wasn't really there at the NATO summit. We had the foreign minister Motegi and also the defense minister Koizumi-san attending the NATO summit related events, and the leader, the IP4 and Secretary General's meeting, for instance, continued to confirm and reinforce the view that the security of the Euro-Atlantic and the Indo-Pacific is inseparable. And I think also that for instance, the fact that the defense minister Koizumi has been tweeting so many pictures of, with the defense ministers, and he basically said that he met with his counterparts in 20 countries. That also shows how effective these multilateral forums continue to be in terms of, increasing the volume and frequency of high-level contacts between both sides of the regions.
Thank you, Koshino-san. I mean, there is an argument to be made here that Japan's relationship with NATO is probably the most developed, or at least has, hardened, institutionalized over time, probably more so than the rest of the IP4. And, perhaps she is shifting to a more bilateral approach where she can hammer out real deals with leaders when they have these summits. I mean, I would argue that maybe you don't get as far in this group setting at the IP4 as you might in dedicated summits. But on the other hand, Japan has a new arms export policy, right? Removing that ban. So this was a chance to compete with with South Korea, with Turkey, with other exporters, and shop that around. So maybe we'll see her, if she's still in office, continue this tradition in the future. So definitely something to watch. Okay, Ruben, it's great to have a Kiwi perspective represented here. So thank you for agreeing to join. From a New Zealand perspective, I mean, what is the benefit that New Zealand gets from being part of the IP4, particularly since they're not part of most of the other minilaterals, several of which Mira mentioned at the outset?
Yeah, thanks, Emma, and hello to everyone on the call today. So for a start, I mean, as a small state, it really reduces transaction costs. We cannot convene these incredibly large meetings on our own. So being able to go to this, where we can rub shoulders with so many countries, leaders, ministers of defense, have consultations around intelligence, policy, interoperability standards, upcoming training exercises and the like is really important for a country like New Zealand. And even though our Prime Minister, Christopher Luxon, didn't attend this year, instead our Minister of Defence did, Christopher Pink, our new Minister of Defence, that's not so much a downgrade because Luxon did attend last year, our Prime Minister, but New Zealand is slowly coming out of its defensive crouch. We are finally, I would say belatedly, rejuvenating the New Zealand Defence Force. We've been spending about 1% of GDP on our military. We are the lowest of any developed world nation in that regard. So we are going to be increasing it in coming years to 2% to try to keep up. We have new major platform purchases underway as well. Some are forthcoming, a whole new frigate fleet. We purchased P-8A Poseidons recently and so on, because we are a maritime nation, right? We're surrounded by water down here. We're giant exclusive economic zones, Antarctica to the south, very fragile Pacific Island nations to the north that China basically covets to try to get strategic positions, logistics agreements. Its submarines are going all through that area as well. So if we think of the three island chains, I mean, if there's a conflict further north from New Zealand in the South Pacific, having Chinese submarines pop up all the way down here to flank Australia, Japan, the US, and so on is a concern for all of us. New Zealand also is, we are starting to focus on military-industrial cooperation. As we go through this rejuvenation of our defence force, we really want to tap into New Zealand firms. We want to tap into quite a rapidly growing dual-use emerging technology ecosystem down here that really needs foreign capital to get going. But we have lots of entrepreneurs, we have lots of smart people, we have good connections with Australia, Japan, the US, and so on. So our Minister of Defence at the NATO Summit actually attended a defence industry meeting on the sidelines. So that's something that we're really trying to push to get our economy into another gear, because we've kind of been stagnant for a number of years. And I just thought I'd note also, New Zealand's recent shift is bipartisan. It goes back to about 2021 under Jacinda Ardern. She was really a liberal internationalist by kind of conviction. But the structural developments in our region, really the growth and expansionism of Chinese presence into the South Pacific, that's our sea lines of communication to the world. During World War II, of course, Australia and New Zealand were threatened, and we were used as kind of rearguard areas to be pushed back against Imperial Japan. As our strategic depth is tangibly contested now, it's inescapable that our political leadership, whether centre-left or centre-right, have to react. There's some pockets of the political class that actually might want New Zealand to pursue quite a neutralist track, but for the time being, they are fighting an uphill battle, and it's, quite frankly, people like me who are trying to argue against that and trying to point out the reality of the emerging geopolitical environment. So one final point, because we're conscious of time, a good thing for things like this NATO IP4 meeting is that it forces New Zealand to kind of pushes the discourse along in New Zealand. New Zealand politicians are very careful of doing anything or saying anything that could anger China, because we don't want them to place trade restrictions or sanctions on us. Last year, Christopher Luxon at the New Zealand Embassy in Beijing said he saw no signs of Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran coordination against the West, whereas now this IP4 document mentions all four of those countries in one sentence. So I don't know what my Prime Minister would say, but nonetheless, we have agreed to a document that directly does point that out, and that can influence the discourse and debate in New Zealand. So it plays a role in helping people like myself get the reality out there to the New Zealand people.
That's fascinating, and really interesting to hear how that's pushing domestic politics. And I guess you said this, you see this as really durable across party lines in different administrations, like regardless of who is in office there.
Yes, correct. So we've gone from a centre-left government under Jacinda Ardern to now a centre-right government. One caveat: we do have a national election coming up in November, and there's some element. And right now, the polling is it's 50-50, every poll, and there are some elements of the political left that could, I suppose, potentially try to redirect New Zealand's recent kind of realist turn away from that. We also have prominent former prime ministers like Helen Clark, and another gentleman from the National Party whose name eludes me. So both former centre-left and centre-right New Zealand prime ministers from the sidelines who are really speaking out quite loudly against New Zealand's recent kind of realist turn. So things could change. I tend to think these things are structural, but watch the space. Let's see what happens in November.
Great. Well, Ruben, if New Zealand ever does figure out a way to convene major leaders, then I would like to be on that invitation list. Not as a leader, but make sure to include me. I'd love to go. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about what's sort of driving some of this cooperation. The first IP4 meeting in 2022 was just a couple of months after Russia invaded Ukraine. And a lot of these Asian countries stepped up, were really part of the process of imposing sanctions on Russia, providing aid to Ukraine. Now we've dragged on for quite some time into this war. So I'm wondering the extent to which particularly the Asian countries here are weary of this. And as well as whether it's going both ways. I think that there is, globally there is concern about China's rise and the direction it's going. But to what extent are the Indo-Pacific countries here getting some reassurances on China? Are they seeing, particularly with the war raging in or reigniting, I guess, in Iran right now? Are European countries able to focus on and coordinate their China strategies, and particularly using this mechanism? Mira, any thoughts on that?
It's a great question, Emma. And I think you are sort of pointing at one of the underbellies of the IP4, at least for now. I think over the period in which the IP4 has existed, NATO's focus and language on China has gotten much, much stronger. That's undeniable, and it's a real achievement. And of course, over the same period of time, we've also seen a lot of other really influential minilateral configurations from the G7 to others adopt much, much stronger language that not only on China, but takes a stake on peace and stability in the Indo-Pacific much more broadly. So these are all real changes. And I think kind of despite the United States' perhaps lack of sustained focus on the issue set right now, are likely to be changes that are here to stay. Nevertheless, it can be quite difficult to use NATO as the primary vehicle to coordinate Europeans on China, because NATO, of course, as seen by our European allies, is a security and defense pact that is meant to defend Europe. And particularly at a moment when Europe is quite literally under attack in a war that has been going on longer than World War I, there is a natural tendency, and I think quite a valid one, to focus overwhelmingly on the security and defense of Europe. Now, there are real challenges that China poses in those areas, including, when it uses tactics like cyber attacks and others that we could name. But when it comes to the challenges that the PRC poses to Europe most consistently and that are most felt, those are actually more likely to come in the political and economic domains and increasingly the technological domain as well. And there, the primary coordinating body for our European partners is the EU. We see the EU grappling right now with what they're calling the second China shock, a real dumping of overcapacity into European markets, real risk to European businesses, and a trend towards deindustrialization that is accelerating quite quickly because of the structure of the Chinese economy combined with very high US tariff levels. So it's quite reasonable that for Europe, the EU actually has increasingly become the locus of European strategic conversation on China. And of course, in addition to that, many European countries have their own distinct China policies and strategies, and several have published their own Indo-Pacific strategy. But this is all to say that because of the way Europe organizes itself, NATO is not a catch-all for the challenges that are posed by the PRC, nor is it the organizing body for all of European action when it comes to those concerns about the PRC. There are nevertheless still very real issues that those allies can discuss when they meet with one another. But to your point, Emma, it really reinforces the fact that in addition to the IP4, bilateral ties and increasing configurations that involve the EU are also going to be necessary to promote the type of cooperation that is very natural between Indo-Pacific allies and European ones, particularly on issues like risks that China poses to security in the tech space or economic practices against which all of these allies are looking for ways to push back.
Yeah, there is a bit of a I don't know if it's a tug of war, but it's where is the center of gravity, right, in Europe for engaging?
And I think it's worth noting that the EU has proven to be a really important mechanism. What we're seeing the EU do right now in terms of really thinking through new tool sets to deal with the economic challenge from China is quite important. And Ursula von der Leyen should get a great amount of credit for the leadership that she has shown on this issue set. But Europe is structured to sort of organize for Europe, and that creates challenges for Indo-Pacific allies who are looking to plug in. It's also worth noting, however, that our European friends in the last several years have vastly increased their Indo-Pacific facing ties, often on a bilateral basis. But as I mentioned, many proffering Indo-Pacific strategies of their own and getting involved in a variety of Indo-Pacific issues in which they might not previously have taken a loud stake, like rule of law and freedom of navigation in the South China Sea. So the IP4 doesn't need to be the catch-all for all Europe-Asia cooperation. But I would argue that the United States and its Indo-Pacific partners should have a strategy for how we are all networking between these two hemispheres across the wide issue set, where the PRC and Russia both pose challenges to our interests.
Right. That's I mean, this is the test, though, right, of all of these middle or smaller powers, of whether or not you can network effectively in the midst of US-China strategic competition. So we're it feels like there's a lot of enthusiasm for that and urgency, I would argue, even from middle powers, but figuring out the right size mechanism to do that is a continual challenge. And that is a nice segue to asking Kuyun about South Korea and their sort of appetite for involvement in other mini-laterals. I mean, South Korea is interesting in that it sits outside of the Quad, obviously, of AUKUS, of even the CPTPP trade deal. It's sort of staked its own area, and really remarkably, where it has engaged heavily is with Japan, in stepping up that bilateral relationship. So Kuyun, do you have a sense of sort of the appetite in Seoul for getting more engaged in these frameworks that bring together other middle powers?
Yeah, actually, the current Lee administration's one of the major diplomatic goal is to garner middle powers and forge a multilateral cooperations in different domains. This is more so because there is kind of understanding that the rise of multipolarity or the American decline, that kind of narratives kind of dominating South Korean diplomatic discussions. But at the same time, it is very important to finding a way, kind of a common ground among middle powers so that we can make a guardrail against great power competition, as well as emerging technologies or other like economic supply chains. All of these are kind of happening all together. It is not just about great power competition, but every domain is in crisis. So in that sense, South Korea tried to forge a kind of multilateral cooperation with other countries, especially about economic supply chain and mineral and minerals as well as emerging technology. Especially South Korea is very keen on creating multilaterals about AI governance, which already we started with the United States during the Biden administration, and try to forge a affordable AI governance can be forged by middle powers between U.S.-China competition. And also, we are also focused on energy kind of sustainability when it comes to not just about mineral, but just about overall energy supply chains. Another area we are focusing on to forge a kind of middle power multilateral cooperation. So, interestingly, this government has very keen on making this multilateral cooperations with the relevant countries. But thing is that the bottom line is that we are very pragmatic, not just kind of hedging beyond two great powers. We are very pragmatic in making this multilateral cooperation with other countries.
Great, thank you, Kyun. Oh, Yuka, yes, do you have a question?
Yes, no, I did also want to jump in since you asked the questions of what are really driving the IP4 partners. Of course, you mentioned China, and we discussed how China is, of course, important, and having China in the NATO strategic concept in 2022 itself is really important and really created a momentum for NATO Indo-Pacific Four countries cooperation. But also just wanted to highlight from Japan's perspective that support for Ukraine is still at the heart of cooperate. That's driving cooperation between NATO countries. But I think it's not just Japan, but also IP4 countries in general. We've seen IP4 members, for instance, contributing to Comprehensive Assistance Package, the CAP, and also contributing to the Prioritized Ukraine Requirements List, PEARL. And for instance, Japan have also contributed its trust fund, I think, for about 100 million in the CAP trust fund. And in 2026, this year, it also contributed approximately $14.6 million dollars for the PEARL program. So that shows that we're still, support for Ukraine itself is really the core for IP4 NATO cooperation. And also, since Kuyon and Ruben also mentioned about how the defense industrial cooperation has also been a driver, and since you, Emma, also touched on Japan's relaxation of its arms transfer policy, I also do think that not really sure if this is kind of like a IP4 kind of cooperation with NATO or individual countries' cooperation with NATO. But I would say from Japan's perspective that defense industrial cooperation, both in terms of defense industrial capacity, cooperation on industrial capacity and supply chain resiliency, and also on defense innovation is also a core areas for effective cooperation between NATOs. And in terms of defense industrial capacity, there has been a lot of discussions around how to cooperate on bolstering defense industrial capacity and a potential contingency. The fact that NATO Secretary General last year, when Rutte became the Secretary General, he visited the Mitsubishi Electric and Japanese defense industries shows, signals that there's clear interest from NATO's side. Also this year, NATO's permanent representatives visit to Japan and meeting with, they met with the foreign minister, defense minister, economic minister, and with the economic minister Akazawa. The kind of topic that they discussed was how to, the importance of cooperating on defense industrial supply chains during contingencies. And also with the Japanese government's recent revisions of the arms transfer regulation was a step change because Japan can now transfer lethal weapons. So it can actually become an enabler for such kind of cooperation on, for instance, production of ammunitions or transfers of ammunitions, because especially this is the area where clearly there needs a cooperation. And also just to add that from yesterday's announcement. I think one announcement was quite interesting. The US and NATO announced that they're going to co-produce the AMRAAM missiles, for instance, or cooperate on maintenance of PAC-3. This is exactly what the US and Japan, for instance, has been working on under the US-Japan Defense Industrial Cooperation and Acquisition and Sustainment, or DICUS, mechanisms. So I thought this announcement actually shows pathways on what a Japan, for instance, US and NATO cooperation might look like in terms of co-production of ammunition and enhancing defense industrial supply chain in this area. So I would say that support for Ukraine is still the core driver, and China is more of a long-term agenda that NATO and IP4s are trying to discuss.
Thanks. That was a lot packed into that. And, I would say that on this, we hear a lot about potential for development of, resilient supply chains, critical minerals, defense industrial cooperation, but actually achieving that is quite hard, like even in, very established alliances that have decades and decades of working together, trying to weave together many countries in that is actually quite challenging to do. So it seems to me that the IP4 is just a way of, like, if the leaders actually show up, it's a way of greasing those wheels diplomatically to sort of create that opening. Ruben, I wonder if you have any thoughts too on ways that New Zealand or Australia, we'll throw that in there, we don't have an Australian here, can contribute to this, defense industrial cooperation. I mean, we do have the AUKUS framework, which is moving but challenging. So I think that one of the only things that came out of that I've seen come out of the IP4 this year was talking about doing more of this defense industrial cooperation across these two theaters.
Yeah, look, it's a really good question. Clearly there's the AUKUS mechanism, which, although it's hit a few speed bumps, it is proceeding, and I can't see it going anywhere. And, to some degree, it's breaking down the institutional barriers between the US, Australia, UK military industrial complexes. And I can't help but think that some of the mechanisms for that could eventually be applied to Europe, with Europe undergoing its rearmament and so on. In New Zealand, New Zealand companies do plug into some of those developments happening in Australia. It's not necessarily formalized through a kind of government level. It's just that we have a free trade agreement, so our companies can readily trade with Australian ones, and through that plug into some of those military industrial trade networks that are evolving. And New Zealand is likely to always kind of favor that approach, a kind of having, I wouldn't say it plausible deniability, but kind of preferring non-kinetic mechanisms, firm-to-firm level, military-industrial connections, and so on. But look, we do have companies operational over there. The SIOS, which is one of our drone manufacturers, they are now co-owned by a UK company. They have manufacturing in New Zealand and in the UK. They have a presence on the ground in Ukraine now. So they are trialing systems, assisting the Ukrainian military, getting lessons learned from that are applicable back into the Pacific. We have a whole host of other companies. Sometimes I think they may simply not be aware that, you may be working on some niche mechanical product in New Zealand or some niche technology algorithm or so on, but their heads are a bit low and they're not kind of aware that there are these international networks they can tap into. So that becomes kind of a task of marketing of our government and our NZDF, our New Zealand Defence Force, tapping these companies, building out an ecosystem and making them aware of the opportunities abroad. But there is also kind of a moral or ethical consideration for some people in New Zealand. New Zealand held on to the end of history narrative for probably longer than any other country in the world. So I think that also does sometimes still influence it to the individual level. Individuals, companies, firms not wanting anything necessary to do with the great power competition breaking out and playing any role in that. So maybe there's something to be done there almost on the ideological level, you could say. But things are moving. Like I said, our Minister of Defence, he is touting New Zealand's wares abroad. Our former Minister of Defence, Judith Collins, she spent a lot of time travelling around the world to different expos and really touting New Zealand's companies, trying to find ways to get them marketed abroad. So I'd say to some degree, watch the space. Things are moving, but whether they can be formalised in any way, I'm not too sure. If I can go off the New Zealand reservation just for a little bit, it does seem to me that the Indo-Pacific Four it's kind of skewed at the moment towards Europe-facing issues for obvious reasons: Ukraine, Russia. But do we want it generating practical and strategic effects in the Indo-Pacific in some fashion? And I keep worrying that let's say something kicks off in Northeast Asia, around Taiwan or South China Seas in the coming years. That's going to implicate the interests of each individual IP4 member and their collective interests to some degree. And we don't want them finding out too late, oh, geez, we really should have had kind of a wish list of what we would want from really European NATO for when this happens. So I think there is some maybe thought pieces that can be put together that kind of work backwards from worst case scenarios in our region to decide, okay, if this happens, what do we want really European NATO to be providing? Because we know the Americans are going to be involved, right, in these crises and conflicts. But what about Germany, France, the UK? What would we be looking for them the day after or the minute after a crisis or conflict breaks out? So I think there's something to be said there. What kind of strategic effects do we want IP4 to be heading towards directionally? And what would it need in the time of crisis that may come in the coming years or months?
That's great. See, I think, Wellington's like the new kid on the block in these emerging, so it's framework. So it's great to have that perspective. I knew we included you for a reason. A reminder to our audience that feel free to submit in the Q&A function questions, comments, beauty tips, whatever you got. And then we'll get to those later on. What was notable, I mean, again, it's been sort of scant reporting out of Ankara. But what was notable in its absence was not a lot of mentions of energy cooperation, particularly because of the Iran crisis. It seems like almost all of these countries must be suffering the effects of this conflict. Now, maybe that's just a reaction to the shifting geopolitical landscape under our feet. I mean, while Trump was there, I think he, said that the Iranian leaders are scum and they're still trading attacks again. So it's hard to react to that. But Mira, I think that the Asia Group just put out a report, I believe, sort of examining this. Do you think there's a reason there wasn't more emphasis on Iran, given the state we're in at the NATO summit?
Well, there's probably at least two answers to that, Emma, and I'll note that both are speculative coming from me, but I'm happy to give it a go. The first is, to our prior round of conversations, NATO does not do everything for Europe. So when it comes to energy issues, supply shocks, the fiscal complications that have all been introduced by the prolonged closure of the Strait of Hormuz, those are largely issues being dealt with both by individual governments and by the EU. And I think Europe has been duly alarmed and coordinating heavily on all of those issues, but NATO is not the primary forum where that coordination takes place. But the second reason is a bit more political. Obviously, the last year and a half under the second Trump administration has been quite challenging for this NATO alliance. And I would say much more so, frankly, than in Asia, where I think our allies, and they should speak for themselves, see real challenges with the United States, but also feel like because of the structure of the way we work together, there isn't necessarily a plan B that would allow them to drive towards regional autonomy increasingly independently of the United States. There's a fair degree of resolve to just do what those allies have to do to keep working with Washington. In Europe, however, there have been a number of sort of strategic shocks, if you will, not least the American threat to invade Greenland, which of course is the territory of a NATO member, which has revealed to the alliance potential real frailty over the next little while Europeans nonetheless deeply want to keep the United States committed to NATO and on a high level committed to the defense of Ukraine. So one can imagine that the U.S. war with Iran, which is deeply unpopular in Europe, and that has created huge problems for Indo-Pacific and for Euro-Atlantic economies, is perhaps not the easiest issue to take up in a NATO context, where European allies are both looking to diffuse potential crises like the renewed Greenland threats, and to keep the United States relatively steady as they try to push forward with Ukraine's defense.
Well, that was a very valiant effort at answering what is a really complicated question. One other question for you, Mira, is this is called the Indo-Pacific Four, all your efforts to get it from the AP4 to the IP4, but there's no India here. And I've seen a number of commentaries out there actually saying like India is very, relevant to these conversations. So anything to comment on the fact that India or where India does engage with NATO? I might have a little bit more sense of how they engage with the Indo-Pacific.
Yeah, I wouldn't expect to see India clamoring to join the IP4 anytime soon. I'd love to be surprised to the upside, but there are a couple reasons to think why this may not be the right format, particularly for Narendra Modi's India. First, of course, is India's got a long tradition of non-alignment, has recently tilted much more towards the United States and its close partners and really accelerated a lot of those networked relationships with Australia, with Korea, with Japan, across the Indo-Pacific, and has increasingly been tilting east to deal with challenges that the PRC poses to East Asia. But India is not interested and is not going to become interested in the near term in being associated with any kind of formal alliance. That's part of why we took pains every opportunity we got to reassure the region and the world that the Quad is not a formal alliance and was not going to become one. But that's also a reason why I would not expect India to be looking to formally plug into what is kind of the paradigmatic American alliance when it comes to the way that the world sees NATO and is above all else a security alliance, undeniably. It's not a great fit for India. Secondarily, of course, over the course of the last 18 months, there have been really challenging relations between the United States and India has kind of moved into a period of increased multi-alignment, which interestingly does very much include Europe. And I expect that we're going to see that trend continue. I know our European partners are finding a huge host of opportunities in these new openings with India. But I think we're likely to see those occur largely in the economic, the technology, and other non-military domains for the time being, with the exception of possible military sales by European countries to India and kind of bilateral level defense cooperation. But the third reason that I'll mention, and of course this one is a little bit more sensitive, is that for all that many of our Indo-Pacific partners and Euro-Atlantic partners are increasingly aligned in the way that they see Russia and China, India is deeply concerned by China as its primary strategic threat, but has a far more complicated relationship with and view of Russia than the United States or many of its closest partners do. And indeed, Russia continues to be included in India's strategy for multi-alignment. So the NATO alliance right now, above all else, as Yuko rightly laid out, is primarily focused on defending against Russia and defending Ukraine. And that would be a troubling fit, I think, from the way that Delhi tries to maintain its very kind of nuanced and nimble relationship with Moscow, much as the United States and its allies see it quite differently.
Great, that's super helpful. I have a lot of good questions coming in now, so I'm going to turn to a couple of those too. Here's one question says, do the panelists see a greater leadership role for the IP4 in pushing back against PRC gray zone competition in the South China Sea and in the vicinity of Taiwan, or a greater cooperation with nations like Vietnam and the Philippines? Does anyone want to take a stab at that?
I think I can comment on this question. Actually, this was very relevant for South Korea because given that China sees this entire West Pacific as a one theaters, we used to think about Yellow Sea, South China Sea, East China Sea as a different kind of theater and separate theaters. But China is looking at this as a kind of one theaters, and they are operating very different gray zones from region to region. So I think IP4 can kind of take a role in this kind of operations and responding to China's gray zones. But there might be a kind of asymmetric kind of interest and capability as well. And actually, what we are expecting from NATO countries in terms of NATO IP4 framework is that NATO countries can kind of contributing to maintaining the stability in the regions, not only for the diplomatic, but also also military kind of perspectives. But there has been kind of also there has been very kind of insufficient efforts in that endeavor as well. But I think this cooperation is very important, and we are looking at. And IP4 countries individually, we are cooperating over this issue with Vietnam and Philippines as well, but not as a kind of military format.
Maybe I'll also add a comment to that. Yeah, I think when it comes to Taiwan or South China Sea, that would probably, the regional mechanisms probably make sense for deeper discussions. But I would say that the role for IP4 and the role for NATO is discussions on these gray zone competitions where geographical kind of distance doesn't matter. Like cyber is definitely a key area that the NATO and IP4 are cooperating on. Countering disinformation is another area. Space is, again, also an emerging area. So I think different mechanisms have different roles for countering PRC's activities.
Great, that's helpful. There's another question here that could go to either Yuka or Kuyun about Japan's views of Korea's role in NATO in the NATO IP4 and probably vice versa. I mean, this is this interesting dynamic between Korea and Japan now, right? Where there is more cooperation, better, feel good shuttle diplomacy going on, but there's still areas of competition. And the IP4 and arms sales, to the European theater could be one of those areas. Do you see, the question coming in here says, how should the two countries balance strategic cooperation with economic and industrial competition? If either of you have thoughts on that, I welcome those.
Oh, I go first.
Okay.
Well, I think industrial competition is pretty natural. We are in a kind of capitalist system. So I think we are expecting industrial and technological competition between two countries. But the thing is that, from my perspective, the important thing is that two countries are still cooperating in the strategic domains. Even though we have a change of administrations, the two-country shuttle diplomacy still maintains, and trilateral cooperation momentum still maintains. I think that's important. I think, there might be kind of different level of cooperation and competition, but at the same time, the momentum for strategic cooperation still remains. I think that's more important than that.
Sure. Maybe I'll add that when we talk about defense industrial cooperations, I think what South Korea is focusing on, which I think is more about sales of complete products to Europe, could be quite different for what Japan is seeking in terms of defense industrial cooperation through NATO. As I mentioned, really enhancing the production capacity of ammunitions, for instance, is a core area where Japan is trying to seek cooperation on, or so I guess the Japan's, and also when thinking about Japan's defense industrial capacity, Japan is also trying to fulfill its own requirements in Japan as well. So sales in Europe is not necessarily the priority, although they also, of course, want to expand sales. Like GCAP is an example where Japan is increasingly cooperating with European partners, but I do see that it's not like necessarily a direct competition. And also IP4 is definitely an important mechanism with South Korea and Japan are working on non-regional cooperations outside of the region of the Indo-Pacific.
Great. And just one more question as we near the end of our hour together. Mira spoke of the frailty of the alliances. Ruben talked about, New Zealand increasing its defense spending beyond the traditional 1%. And it feels like this is lurking in the background of all of these conversations, right? Like the extent to which US is putting pressure on all of its allies to spend, a much greater amount of its GDP on its own defense and some degree of retrenchment. To look at our own hemisphere. So I imagine that can drive at least some sideline conversations during these kind of events, even if there's not a statement particularly about it. But I welcome your sense of whether or not that's sort of animating this cooperation, and if there could be more coordination to push back against some of these demands. Any thoughts on that as we finish out?
I'll have a stab. I'm not entirely sure about coordinating mechanism. I mean, Trump does seem pretty good at directing his attacks at individual countries, but also writ large. I think also, you know, I'd wager in all our countries, depending upon the amount of defense spending and the domestic, societal, and political comfortability with that level of defense spending, what Trump has done to some degree is he's helped out a lot of countries. I mean, take a lot of those NATO countries that may actually, a number of leaders may wish they had the social and domestic license to be spending more, but they haven't been able to do it, whether that's because the domestic population simply hasn't felt the threat coming from Russia to the degree perhaps they should, the Ukrainians just being so successful at holding the Russians back. So Trump, in some respects, he will yell at them, he will attack them, and then, of course, they might kind of yell at him gently back, but then behind the scenes, they're like, oh, actually, this is terrific. This gives us an excuse to start, greasing the wheels of these sometimes pretty geriatric military machines that we haven't had the social license to do so in quite some time. And I think there is belated recognition, like the world, the data points just stack up over and over again. 1 year after the war, Russia-Ukraine, maybe you're like, oh, okay, well, the Russians aren't doing great, so why do we have to worry? But the war keeps grinding on. China's military buildup keeps going. There's a war in the Middle East, et cetera, et cetera. And enough of the domestic population just see the data points day to day, week to week, and that gives the political actors the freedom to start spending more money on the military. That coincides with Trump's attacks, but nonetheless, despite Trump's attacks, the argument, I think, is so strong now. So I think there's kind of multiple things interplaying here. So I don't know if IP4 would want to truly push back, at least not on that piece of Trump's critique. Maybe on some other things, perhaps, like upholding rules and norms and the free and open Indo-Pacific. I think we all agree. The Indo-Pacific Four countries all agree. We all want to do that. So to the extent that Trump undermines that, we might push back against that. But, from what I see, Trump, to some degree, there's quite a bit of continuity going all the way Obama through Trump, Biden, and Trump again now in terms of some commitment to the Indo-Pacific. I mean, every now and then he might say, oh, maybe we'll leave the alliance with South Korea or Japan or what have you. But he hasn't. Not a single alliance between the United States and any of its allies has collapsed under the Trump administration, the first term or second term. So I think that tells you a lot, actually, about where Trump sees America's interests are. It is holding on to the American, what do you want to call it, extended deterrence zone, if you will. Thank you.
Mira, you want to have one last intervention as we round this out?
Happy to. Yeah, I just wanted to build on Ruben's last comment to note, that I think it's an important observation that, as of today, all America's treaty alliances absolutely still stand. And I expect that they're going to on the back end of this administration, albeit in a somewhat transformed state. However, I do think there's a strategic change taking place right now that's going to be really important for both Europe and Indo-Pacific allies to coordinate around. And even though the right mechanism is probably not the IP4, for all of the reasons we've talked about over the course of this conversation, I do hope they will coordinate around their strategic responses to that. And that is the fact that it's unclear where the United States currently stands when it comes to the People's Republic of China. Is this truly a competitor? Is that a central organizing principle to U.S. foreign policy? Or is the United States pursuing something that looks like more of a full-scale rapprochement with the PRC, with uncertain implications for its allies in the Indo-Pacific and in Europe, particularly at a time when all those allies are feeling in many ways PRC aggressiveness more profoundly than ever? Particularly, as Ruben said in a prior answer, because the United States has gone a little bit wishy-washy on Taiwan, I would strongly hope that our Indo-Pacific and Euro-Atlantic allies will find ways with increasing intensity and urgency to coordinate around questions of how they might usefully dissuade and deter the PRC from acting against Taiwan below the military threshold, which I tend to see as an increasing risk in an increasingly short time frame around the 2028 elections in Taiwan or shortly thereafter. The US, of course, and many of its close allies have thought for a really long time about what it would mean to have a Chinese attack on Taiwan and how they would potentially act under that contingency. But something that really deserves focus and attention in both Asia and Europe is the question of how both sets of allies would respond to profound economic punishment of Taiwan by China or other gray zone coercion tactics that could be coming up much sooner than we think. So particularly with NATO perhaps being an imperfect vehicle for those conversations, but the United States pushing less than it has in the past on this question, I think this is perhaps the most salient and pressing issue for Indo-Pacific and Euro-Atlantic cooperation, and I hope our allies will take it up.
Well, that was a meaty comment to conclude this session. And the IP4 might be an imperfect vehicle for some of those challenges, but it's a great vehicle for looking at all of these different geopolitical developments that we have covered over the course of the hour. So thank you so much to the panelists. Thank you to the audience for your very thoughtful questions. And we will see you next time on another webinar. Thanks to all you. Bye-bye.